Good day, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before I get started,
Let me see if
my
I can
apologies for
adjust
not
the
being
volume
able to
here.
join you in person. I'm in a different time zone, but it's a great pleasure to be amongst you. I want to thank the Architectural Ceramic Assembly Workshop for including us this year. The folks from Boston Valley Terracotta, as well as Carnegie Mellon University School of Architecture and the University of Buffalo School of Architecture, all of whom have contributed in some way or other to the work that's ongoing. The talk tonight will address what we've done with the earth in the context of essentially terracotta, tile, bricks, clay, all of the things that take us back to some of the early works that I did early on at Office-Da, but also that has evolved into more recent works that have been recently developed. I was once asked, what does all of this have to do with my own personal history as an Iranian? And I had little to offer at that moment, but in looking more deeply at the history of the Seljuk period, the Safavid period, and the Qajars, I discovered an interesting relationship between structure and skin, and the ways in which structure can essentially evoke ornament itself through the inner workings of its structural constitution in the Seljuk period, how in the Safavid period that structural layer becomes a skin, and by the time of the Qajar period, literally just becomes just a tile. These were important evolutions because they also show a transformation in ethic. In the first phase, as the calligraphic ornament becomes an alternative to figurative representation of the Western world, and how that during the Safavid period essentially takes on certain colors and different modalities. And then by the time that it gets to the later period of the Qajars and beyond, you can even see the grid of the tile being completely independent of the constitution of the wall itself. All of this composed of raw material, a resource from the earth itself, and of course here refashioned in the sinuous serpentine walls of the University of Virginia and the Dieste walls of the Atlantida Church in South America. And here to the right, the infamous bonding system that shows how sometimes the mortar is the key protagonist rather than the brick itself. And this became an idea for us to develop an approach towards means and methods where we're not just designing the image of the building, but beginning to refashion the way that we build, looking at the means and methods, which is very much at the core of these workshop activities, to rethink a certain material, but also the labor processes. In traveling to Venezuela, we discovered tiles, blocks, and bricks, and they became the precondition for us to work with, the tiles on the roof, the bricks on the side wall, and the blocks on the front facade, and recognizing that there are really two very different ways of thinking about figuration. On the left side, you can see that the figures that emerge from the brick are completely independent of the bonding system, whereas the more abstract and sinuous evocations of figure on the right emerge directly from the relief work within the brick itself. and we wanted to participate in both modalities. But importantly, by interpreting the mortar as a variable condition, we discovered what we called the variable bond, where we oscillated the mortar line between a running bond and a Flemish bond to produce a gradient, as it were, that could slip and slide and produce conditions of porosity and rotation where solid walls become more transparent. And this was an important moment in developing what is here Casa La Roca, a house dedicated to a court whose view is of a rock, an existing rock that was some 20 feet tall in the back garden that needed some shielding from the neighbors to the right. And that folded wall on the right-hand side really is the topic of this discussion, because we had to come up with a way of developing a tectonic that is constructed around the fold itself, minimizing the cuts of brick while giving it lateral bracing through the folds itself. All of this in a house that is dedicated to a promenade that goes up the building and to the roof to get a view of the valley below of Caracas. So the folding emerges from a diagonal bonding system that is able to expand and contract parametrically, as it were, to produce the side elevation. By doing this, the regulating lines are essentially constructed on the diagonals, and therein constructing an integral relationship between geometry and construction itself. Note that the geometry of the bottom is exactly the inverse of the geometry at the top, as the diagonal line essentially pixelates a ruled surface going from the bottom to the top. And by doing so, allows for the passage of air and light into what is essentially a laterally braced wall. The premise is constructed around the development of certain points in a running bond system here. And by expanding and contracting the mortar line, the production of air in between. The wall then is allowed to migrate, bend, fold back and forth as needed. And essentially, the constitution of the wall is then described by a structural skin. And so the curtain-like effect is not merely representational, it is constitutional to the wall itself. And so there is a sense of its diaphanous figure, but the reality is that it's absolutely rigid and structural and static. The house, never having been built, was then translated actually not into a terracotta system, but a wood system in the hookah den for Mantra, a kind of jolly screen that has a star-like figure at the top and almost a circular figure at the bottom, for which we ourselves developed the means and methods, essentially by pinning the drawing up on the ceiling, dropping plumb bobs, and getting within a 16th inch of a tolerance as we stacked, glued, and screwed the pieces together of plywood, but really of a masonry logic. And realizing that by doing that, we had cut off over $100,000 of the budget that the contractor had reserved for this structure. We had built this ourselves. It was our first construction job. It was our first full-scale mock-up. That was the building itself. And so our adventures into means and methods and fabrication really started at this point. But this had to also be translated into a larger scale. At the scale of buildings here, we were interested in translating our obsession with terracotta, clay, and bonding into a building here, the Tongshin Art Center, where the figures of distortion are informed by the necessity for slopes for drainage, for the Venturi effect of a chimney, or the need for skylights, or the circulation that goes underneath a stair. For a complex that is just outside of Beijing, a series of studios, galleries, and courtyards, the full extent of this variable bond was exercised here, really focused on the minimal spaces that one could carve essentially out from underneath the stairs. As they rise, the headspace underneath gives way to some of these spaces of circulation underneath. In turn, roofing drains also find their way into downspouts and spouts that exit the building in different ways, using the bonding system as a trigger for their tectonics. The actual building that eventually got built was only the gatehouse, a structure that is essentially 2 studios and a staircase, and was built around the Roman model, where the brickwork becomes the formwork for the insulation and the concrete, and then gets stacked up accordingly. And so the gate effectively becomes an incomplete queue, carving out the passage of the threshold on one side, and mirroring essentially the promenade that is the diagram of the circulation going up the building, allowing for the corridor and the stair to occupy the same space. So one weaves in a figure 8 from one side to the other side, constantly going around the underbelly of a stair and then up the stairs to the final destination of the roof, where the common area is that overlooks the gardens. And here then the figure is made clear, is such that the compression of the variable bond system tilts in relationship to the roof itself, the necessary slope it requires to expel the water out onto the garden side. And here, recognizing that this is not in fact merely a brick building, but really a brick skin that is the formwork for a concrete structure, allowing for this composite structure to cantilever, over 20 feet in one direction, and using the Flemish bond to excavate voids out of it for the mechanical systems underneath, among other kinds of distortions that it requires as it figures itself in the landscape. The idea of this masonry system, of course, we've used as follies in different ways here, just as a little exercise, a dresser that we designed concurrently with that conceals the structure only to reveal the running bond masonry system of the wood that magically cantilevers out, using the logic of masonry to do such. Behind all of this is a premise, what I call the tectonic grain, and it's something we borrow, let's say, from nature here in the context of a zebra. It's striping as acquiring a certain meaning in relationship to its torso and legs. Of course, everybody knows that this is not actually how the grain works in a zebra. In fact, the striping is always perpendicular to the limb as well as the torso, and the architecture of it is in turning the corners between the two. But what you and I do as architects is artificial, and so we are constructing grains constantly, and our architecture is always in a state of debate between the actuality of construction on the one hand and the image, the representation that thereof within the context of buildings. So this brings us to the Rock Creek House, which, interestingly enough, was a traditional Neo-Georgian house depicted above. A family wanted to stay in the house as it was expanding. They had, they went from 1 to 2 to 3 kids and simply wanted to remain in the neighborhood and remain with their friends. And so to use the attic space as an addition. But to do so, they wanted to also excavate southern exposure on one side and use the brick, the excavated brick of that southern exposure to build the facade of the north. So essentially a kind of cut and fill operation. So the brick construction, the load-bearing brick construction of the north maintains a vestige of its original image with its windows more or less intact in place, a slightly new roof line, of course, occupied by the new attic. But in contrast, then, because the whole southern wall is taken over with a lot of steel, almost like a Frankenstein, it's a curtain wall that takes over on the south, allowing for what is ostensibly a very porous relationship with interiors, the random figures of which correspond to the exact new distribution of bedrooms and living rooms and staircases and so forth. And so these two characteristics of the building in brick, one in load-bearing condition, the other one in curtain wall with a side elevation making that transition. Allowing also the millwork of the interior to come into full exposure from the landscape side. The building then is composed of certain structural walls, almost like party walls between its different sections, and the millwork is part of that tectonic grain. It extends that logic north-south, allowing the light from the south to come all the way through the north. You can see it through the pickets of the railing with the kind of flat stacked panel work on the east and west sides. In a way, they emulate what the brick is doing through wood construction. But then allowing the brick to turn the corners in dialogue with a glass detail that renders ambiguous moments of depth and thinness. In fact, these are not just windows, they're fully inhabitable spaces in the space of the curtain wall, where the brick is not so much rendered thin, but massive. And so these deep spaces become seats, chaises longues, and other areas that mediate between the inside and the outside. And the building then occupies a kind of the formality of the symmetry of the front facade to the right, but the informality of the backside as it opens out over the views of Washington, D.C. This obsession with brick, of course, becomes, let's say, much more mediated in the context of urban design projects and institutional projects. In this case, the Rhode Island School of Design, where the identity of the campus is in correspondent dialogue with the character of Providence itself, the brick becoming essentially a message of history, and in some ways, a diplomatic act to bring a building into its context. In our case, North Hall had to take up a significant size and scale on top of Prospect Hill. And so the brick was used as a kind of liner of retaining walls that come and define a new Nickerson green, but also a south facade that establishes a new frontal elevation in relationship to Waterman Street. Here, evoking the original brick with a kind of its own bonding system, we instead develop a veneer system. By definition, everything is veneer these days, but how to produce the effect of depth when you know you only have a veneer to work with. And so the paneling systems both corbel out and get carved in as a mechanism to establish the placement of this new building that would otherwise be thin, but has to be in dialogue with buildings of the 18 and 1900s to create this new urban connection between Brown University and the RISD Woods-Gary building. In tandem with that, a kind of monolithic colossal colonnade evoking the logo of RISD itself, amongst which you walk as you enter the building at a colossal scale. The building is excavated at the base for the public spaces, but then it creates a deep and thick wall on the south that takes advantage of the southern light to produce a depth it doesn't actually have. Note the building on the left side, which is from the 80s, that effectively paints on the brick in one layer. Our building instead attempts to carve out of the 9-12 inches every bit of corbelling that we can get to give an illusion of mass and weight where there is none. And part of this has to do with the way in which we establish volumes, but also ways in which skin and volumes come into dialogue with each other. You can see the top of the building where the vertical battens are somehow in dialogue with the vertical and horizontal siding of the neighborhood, whereas the brick with the bases of other buildings. Please note that, of course, this is a wood building. And the irony is that we were able to fabricate this building 3 months faster than normal because it was all prefabricated. And because of that, there was very little waste in the construction site. You can see the cleanliness of the site as the pre-drilling of the I-beams and the mechanical systems were almost in place and become part of the embodied experience of the building itself. The idea that a natural resource like brick comes from the earth is then exercised in a completely different way in southern France in a project that is a house, but is more than anything a landscape project. It is a garden. It is a space on the side of a hill in Ramatuelle overlooking the Mediterranean, and because of certain setback rules needs to step back with a certain cadence. But this gave us the opportunity not so much to work in brick, but to work with the clay of the earth itself, radically cutting into that earth in order to create the building. It is a violent act. Indeed, we also had to figure out a way to stagger the building so that it would essentially, save the trees, but make a landscape building that terraces up into the site. The diagram of the building is as such. The building plan distorts to maximize the panoramic views on one side and the focal views on the opposite side. What would have been an internalized courtyard building gets terraced into an open court as it slopes and opens to the view towards the Mediterranean. And then the roof line opens up to the west, to the Pinus Pinei on the opposite side. And then the landscape is drawn into the gateway, into the building, up into the living areas and beyond, up towards the west. The building, indeed, the earth of this building, indeed, is not so much brick, but concrete. The aggregate of that very ground is the substance of this building. Now, we had fashioned many other ways of fabricating this building, because we had thought that the aggregate may play a much more vocal role in constituting this. In fact, we developed a logic where the interior pores would be smooth, and then we might add aggregates of different sizes in different cast panels as we go up, so that by the time that you are in the landscape itself, you have a virtual stone wall in and of itself, naturally very customized and challenging to fabricate. The idea was shelved, but we went back to the idea of the means and methods and how the formwork itself could take on a much more vocal role in the context of concrete. Here, using the warmth of that aggregate, of that earth, to evoke the sensation of wood by sandblasting that wood and casting that concrete within the board form work that you see here, with the natural color of that concrete evoking a sense of a wooden building. As we then transition, from this concrete building and its sinuous roof, we also had the opportunity to work in Dorchester, Massachusetts, on the Adams Library, a building that needs to mediate between the public and the private realm in a local suburb. The logic of this building is to give a civic front on one side of the building, while encouraging a more domestic promenade on the backside that emulates the roof line of the context itself. Then using the roof as a fifth facade, because all of the buildings are taller and look down on it, bringing all of the water hydrology of the site to a kind of garden in the back, while taking a new courtyard space in the front and putting its program to the north to frame an existing oak tree that we were able to save on the north part of the site. Now, while the shelving is running north-south, the roofing beams are running east-west. And this is a kind of laminar condition that one experiences as one enters into this building, into the organization of the building, and effectively frame some of the more civic experiences, such as the reading garden in the north. The building is then essentially composed of terracotta panels in its entirety, evoking a kind of depth of the fluting year you see of the Doric order, but while maintaining a strict horizontal monumentality on one side and the breakup of the roof line on the opposite side. These two facades bookend the site and allow for a completely different kind of reading for the two sides. The scalloping that you see here is evocative of the depth of a loading condition that this building doesn't have, because in fact it's a rain screen. On gray days, it is rather flat and mute, and on sunny days, of course, it is deeply scalloped and ornamented as a consequence of it, but it draws from a custom profile that is able to be used to create what are called brick-sided buildings. This is a tradition specific to New England, where sometimes brick was used as sidewalls when they're close to other buildings to create a firewall, or alternatively, where there wasn't enough budget to go from stone all around the building. One went from stone to wood or to brick. And that essentially it's a tectonic that is sort of almost like wallpaper. It has no tectonic veracity. It is a moment where two architectures meet at a line and describe the different facets of the neighborhood. And this is a building that very much as a skin evokes that thin line between the neighborhood and the main street, the garden, and the street. And so within the context of this construction, each face gains its own identity as it travels around, using the colors of terracotta, classical terracotta, to create essentially a landscape that is not only in the facades, but also in the reflected ceiling plan. The reflected ceiling plan, composed here of wood and acoustic panels, essentially is a striation of the beams that connects the east and the west. Here, the monumental civic side on one elevation, and here, the broken down elevation of the opposite side from the interior. The plan is rather simple, actually, that it has an adult section, an adolescent section, a children's section, and they're all divided into three parts, with the poche areas in pink being service areas. An organic plan that is the result of a lot of community planning, but then that produces certain civic spaces that bring the weight and depth of the terracotta in evidence in the sun, but always to a blade's edge thinness on its sides. Here, working with essentially Greek vases and a coloring of a kind of deep aubergine on one hand and the classic terracotta red on the other, and the white glazed tile on the other, to evoke a sense of formality in the front, a rawness in the courtyard, and a transitional burnt amber in certain carved areas. The sum of which produces, in fact, a very porous building that brings the library back into dialogue with its context. So with that, I thank you all for the opportunity of speaking and bring essentially the talk to a close around not so much terracotta, but the way in which these technologies come into bearing on other messages. In RISD, the Nickerson Green, in Villa Varroise, a commitment to the landscape and the terracing of Ramatuelle. In this case, the saving of the oak tree was the big political act. The idea that these are always in service of a larger sustainable message, and the idea that certain natural aspects of the site, not only the earth from which we gain the terracotta, but also the existing trees, the flora and the fauna, are part of the heritage to which we must respond. Thank you very much, and a good night to you all.
Okay, so I think we're gonna try this. It's unfortunate, but thank you so much first for a very provocative lecture. We've just ended a week of considerable research work, a lot of physical labor as well, putting together these prototypes which are downstairs right now. We're going to, after this lecture, go down there and celebrate the end of the workshop. One thing that I thought was very interesting, a point you made, and I wanted to sort of explore that, this relationship between, as you said, this is what architecture is always doing, the relationship between its representation, our perception of what it is, and what it is ultimately altering, its constructability, its ability to hold something up, its structure, perhaps one can call that its performance, although that may not be the correct word. I think you'd use a slightly different word. And you mentioned a few projects come to mind where you sort of, tried to make something very heavy feel very light. For instance, the wood grain on the concrete, which then also is the color of the concrete made into a beige color, or other places where, let's say, a terracotta piece is perceived to be like a curtain, very, very light, when in fact it's rather heavy. So these kind of juxtaposition, I bring these up because terracotta historically has been particularly good at lying, because it has always been used in this sort of fashion where it doesn't pretend to be not itself, but pretends to be another noble material like stone, or even in some cases now we see terracotta floors, well, ceramic floors that look like wood. And I'm sort of interested also in this ability of terracotta to, or ceramics in general, to be many things. Maybe you can speak a little bit more to that. Clearly, there's an area of imagination you find in that kind of exploration, in that a kind of a material search. It's not a truth to materials as we've known it, but a different thing. Maybe you can a little bit to that.
So, I mean, just as a way of starting the conversation, I would say that I hear jackals in the background. I'm not sure if you can hear them, but I'm in the hills, in the mountains of Lebanon right now. So I hope they're not coming through, but they sound wonderful from where I am. The initial phases of this discussion starts about 20 years ago, when, 20, 30 years ago, I should say, when I had just graduated, and the common morality that we're taught in school is an ethic about truth and using material the right way. And there's a certain ethics that comes with it. And then as I stepped into practice, the realization that the majority of buildings are actually much more complex and contradictory in the way that they negotiate the composite nature of a wall thickness, the different laminar facets that they have from the interior to the exterior, and what truth is there to be exposed in it. And therein comes certain architectural choices. We almost always invariably amplify one attribute of the building, whether it is lightness or its weight and so forth. And so the narrative in this instance becomes much more important. And I think it's Wigley that sort of overthrows this idea of structure, making claim that the structure is in service of the skin, not vice versa. And so I think understanding that and understanding the latitude of terracotta, you then come to appreciate the way in which, even within regimes of representation and ornament, there are ethics and there are disciplines and there are rigors. And I think this is the terrain in which we've been exercising the majority of our work. And it is not a repudiation, obviously, of how materials work, but they're always a negotiation and a mediation with them. So it tells a slightly more complex story than the kind of the leitmotifs that the 20th century generated, the 5 points of architecture, for instance. There's always much more hidden behind that. And so I'm trying to get at this other nuance that lies in there with works that we can't understand as easily as some of the canons. So all of these, the works that we're struggling with in RISD, trying to make a thin curtain wall look massive, is about, it's something that Kahn struggled with all the time, the producing the effect of permanence in a building culture that is really about much more of a temporariness than history would enable, in the time of antiquity.
I wanted to pick up also on your question of ethics and how we think about that now, as you say that the modernist truth framing ethics in a very puritanical way. Perhaps now there's other issues, for instance, sustainability is an ethic. The fact that many of the participants here brought this up, why they are motivated to use ceramics now. Why clay is a question we've been all sort of posing. And one of those is low embodied energy, acceptability, all of those things that, make less of an ill effect on our climate change. And at the same time, there's also other ethics we haven't brought up, which is labor.
Yes.
Yeah, the problems of building, and we have seen how the abuse of labor, especially in very complex modern buildings, has taken place all over the world, whether we look at Dubai or China or other places. And how these things are factors really in the choice, not only the material, the choice of how these things come together, the forms that one sort of even begins to speak about. So maybe you could speak a little bit of how you're thinking about this question of sustainability and other ethics, particularly outside of maybe the ones you've just spoken about.
Yeah, I mean, super interesting. I think the discussion of labor, but by the way, the way that we came into means and methods was purely accidental. We wanted to design something. It was, the hookah den was budgeted at, it was priced at, I should say, 220,000, and that just wasn't tenable. And so we developed our own way of building it, and we were able to build it for $30,000. There was almost $200,000 difference in there, and we were young, we were innocent, we had no idea how quantity surveying happened. We had no idea how labor was priced and budgeted. But realizing the politics of means and methods, the idea that, the architect is ostensibly responsible for design intent, whatever that means, and that the contractor, the builder, is responsible for how it's done, seemed completely contradictory to any ethic that we would aspire to. And so labor is at the center of that discussion, and gaining a certain control over, how one does these things, recognizing that sometimes even more craft or more labor produces a different quality for the building, and a case for its permanence, a longevity, which is more sustainable than targeting buildings that have a lifespan of 20, 30 years. But to be fair, with that comes other commitments and other ethics. If we're going to talk about sustainability and design buildings around human comfort alone, and not the comfort of the earth or the state of the fauna and the flora, it doesn't seem sustainable at all. So we would need to change the way that we think about buildings entirely. The mechanical systems are not the answer to that. A renewed emphasis on passive systems, a recognition that the 20th century dealt in a revolutionary way with steel and concrete, but it never really addressed the question of insulation and the kind of the envelope with the kind of urgency that it required. And so, and I think of that as the 21st century problem. How do you develop an attitude that essentially neutralizes the need for cooling and heating to the degree that it is possible, pushing the need for the mechanical systems to the extremes, not the convention. But I also see embedded in this discussion a profound anachronism and political problem. I mean, the energy use that we see currently in North America and Europe is so asymmetrical in relationship to other parts of the globe. And without coming to a global social contract around how we build and how we use energy, I see this as a dead-end discussion, so that we need to also come to grips with a completely different way of motivating certain decisions that are not defined by nation state sort of delineations, but something that is much more planetary. And if that's aspirational, it's also a reality that we have to deal with, because the existential nature of that crisis is actually upon us. Some people say it's too late, too little, too late, because certain things will take place anyway. But I do think that this is one of those things that has to be addressed within the discipline with some gravity.
One more question regarding this perhaps shift within the workshop. A few firms have really started talking about the end of the glass building, and the glass building tied to not only, I think, the questions of energy you're talking about, but also transparency, lightness, all those things that we valued almost on an ethical level in the modern period, and a real desire. I think there's a sort of a funny question about birds and birds roosting in old buildings versus glass buildings, and I think the retort here, Gustavo from Ethics Collaborative, was quite good. What about the birds that crash into a glass building? So I do think this question of, as you're saying, a larger social contract, not only globally, but also between fauna and flora, as well as human habitation. What is your, I mean, as you're thinking forward with your work, you're also constantly mitigating this question of transparency. I think a lot of your work does sort of play on this kind of inside-outside. How do you see that evolving, especially with large, tall buildings that are also now slowly becoming far more opaque?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've had the opportunity to really think this through with any level of sophistication. I can only by way of anecdote tell you that, because I've spent so much time at home during the COVID period, I live in a loft with punched openings, and I've seen at least 3 birds fly into my windows, and it's a violent and scandalous moment when that happens. I'm usually on the phone or on a Zoom call when it happens, and I stop trying to figure out, whether the bird survived or not. But I think there's much that architecture is a violent act on the earth. One of the reasons I showed the image of the excavation of the Villa Varoise, which is fundamentally about building landscape over the building, recessing the building underground, is also to show that to do that, you have to essentially lacerate the earth, perchance to save the trees behind it, to do so. So I don't really think we have a broader theory about our relationship to nature, to the flora and fauna. I don't think we teach that. I don't think we learn that. And I don't think we have even understood how large a sustainable human footprint on this earth we have. So that then looking at questions of, whether buildings are glass or they're this or that, to some degree, they're just a kind of epiphenomena of a growing human footprint. And we sort of stumbled into these ethics, I should say, that we absorbed some of the modernist ethics about working with constraints, but we worked our way towards an architecture of profound transformation to the point of mannerism, all of which is absolutely careless about these questions, not because they don't care about them, but they're so focused on the question of language that they require a deep and sustained ethic about how do you build with complexity. Now that we're coming full circle to, questions of how we build with sustainable ethic, I would say that all of the emphasis we put on elaboration some 10 years ago, we're putting into questions of simplicity or the ethics of reduction or the elimination of trades or added labor. I mean, there is an art to that also, the aesthetics of which will look ultimately very different, but they will emerge less out of a focus on the object and more on the processes that get us there, and subsequently an appreciation of the aesthetics that emerge out of curious protocols. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful framing, I think, of an aesthetic yet to be determined.
Sorry, your voice isn't coming through right now. Could you?
It's still not coming through?
It's just hollow right now. Maybe it's the way that you're holding the mic. I'm not sure.
It could be that.
All right. Yeah.
I did want to, we're coming to a close, and I know that you are probably hitting midnight and we don't want to keep you up any longer. Are there just one more question perhaps from the audience? A second question.
I would ask the question, build upon your question, it ties it back to terracotta and what he's talking about in terms of this interface, because it's sustainability, it's building the. Can you hear me? Nader, can you hear me?
Barely, but I can hear you.
Okay. My question is building upon Omar's question about opacity of buildings, and also just thinking that here we are at a terracotta or ceramics workshop, and how the play of kind of combining what Omar is asking and what you're saying, what role terracotta might have in helping mitigate that.
I mean, look, I think for me, the discussion about terracotta has, on the one hand, the promise of looking back at the earth, literally and conceptually. Literally in the sense that, in countries with less economic reach, the clay underneath your foot, your ability to carve even a rectangle out of it, to dry it, is the promise of a building block. From a conceptual point of view, the earth underneath you is the same earth that I'm standing on right now on two different continents. We are 7 hours away, maybe 9 hours away. I have no idea, but what we do here will impact you there and vice versa. And so how we think about that is a question of great gravity. Now, to the extent that my arguments about means and methods have been, on the one hand, about labor and process, but on the other hand, about the potentials of expression and what architecture can do that no other art can do, it is also about how we as architects are arbitrators of advancing a form of knowledge that no other medium can do. And so terracotta's malleability, the way that it is baked, the way that it is glazed, the way that it is sculpted, all of those matter. And whether the entirety of society understands why this building looks this way or that building looks that way matters less at that point. What matters is that one is able to radicalize the potential of each medium, and I think terracotta is poised in a very good situation between its source as a resource of the earth and the kinds of things that are being done with it. So and maybe this lecture was about some of the more rudimentary aspects of that in the early work, and some of the more elaborative aspects of that in the later works.
Thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a wonderful discussion, really beautiful work to share with us, to bring a close to the workshop. I wish you a wonderful night. We're going to go celebrate now and enjoy the work that everybody's produced. To our people who have stood with us for this whole time, quite a few participants around the world who are following the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Please look us up, the Architecture Ceramic Assemblies Workshop. If you are interested in joining us in the future, please do go to the website and send us some information about you. And hopefully we have other occasions, and do buy the books. They'll give you a better insight as to what's going on. Thank you and good night.